Recording. We will start webinar now.
Anything? Hello. Welcome, everyone. Come on in if you would like to use the chat function as it's tradition in our tree fund webinars. Let us know where you're from, how you're doing. Montana, California, Chicago, welcome, welcome. Ohio, Midwest representing. 'Tis the season where we're all feeling different temperatures outside. I hope we're all doing well. Welcome. Oregon. Oh, we've got some other Canadians joining us with our presenters and many people across the sea. We're excited to host everyone today. Thank you for coming. Hello. About 24 hours ago, we had about 1,500 people registered for this wonderful webinar. So we're hoping to be able to crack 1,000 people and have a great attendance today. Cheers from Canada. The sun is shining in Oregon. Well, it's shining here in Iowa where I am, and it's still bitter cold. Aloha. Welcome, welcome, everyone. We will get started here in very, very shortly with our introductions. We want to start as soon as we're able to at the top of the hour so that we can have as much time to hear our presenters and then be able to ask some questions. And with that, we do have the Q&A. There's a separate Q&A available for you. So if you do have questions as the presentation is going on, please direct your questions in there, and we'll be able to answer that at the end and filter through those as we need. Thank you. Keep letting us know where you're from. And kind of as a final reminder, as you let us know where you're from, you do not need to let us know your ISA numbers. We got all of that information when you registered. And so as that is rolling and continuously goes, just feel free to speak and let us know where you're from. But again, any questions, put in that Q&A component. Otherwise, we will get started here really shortly. Well, Vince, if you want to get us started and welcome everyone.
Sure. Thank you, Heath. Just wanted to quickly mention on behalf of the Alabama Cooperative Extension System and Auburn University, we're excited to be a part of this webinar series and host the session. My name is Vince Carter. I'm filling in for Bo Broadbeck and coming in from Southeast Alabama. So with that, thank you again for letting us be a part of this series, and I'm going to turn it over to Paul.
Great. Thanks, Vince. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar hosted by Tree Fund. Thrilled to see such a diverse group of arborists, researchers, and tree care business owners joining us from around the world. As I go through my introduction, we wanted to share a few photos from the 2023 Tour de Trees and some of our other community education events from this year. Special thanks to photographer Chris Banks for the images that you will see. Before we delve into our exciting topic lined up for today, I want to take a moment to express our gratitude for your continued support. The tree care community is not just a professional network, it's a family bound by a shared passion for arboriculture and environmental stewardship. And events like this webinar series provide a valuable platform for us to connect, learn, and grow together. As many of you may know, today is not just any Tuesday, it's Giving Tuesday. Following several days of conspicuous consumption, from US Thanksgiving to several branded days of shopping, Giving Tuesday is a global day of generosity that kicks off the charitable season. It's a day when individuals and organizations come together to support the causes that matter most to them. At Tree Fund, we've been dedicated to advancing the knowledge and skills of arborists, promoting research, and fostering a sustainable future for our urban forests. This brings me to a humble request. As we freely share knowledge and insights in these webinars, as a nonprofit, we also rely on the generosity of our community to sustain this initiative. If you find value in the resources and expertise shared here, if you believe in the importance of cultivating a community that prioritizes the health and well-being of our trees, I encourage you to consider making a donation to support our free webinar series and work. You should see more information, including a QR code, on your screen. Please know that your contributions go a long way in ensuring that we can continue to provide you high-quality content, engage renowned speakers, provide a platform for the exchange of ideas that shape the future of arboriculture. Whether it's a small contribution or a more substantial one, every dollar counts, and your support truly makes a difference. We also want to note that for those of you seeking continuing education units, CEUs, for attending today, your name and certification number will be submitted to ISA and SAF for your CEUs on your behalf based upon your registration. You do not need to put that information into the chat. Please note that your certification number needs to be formatted correctly. If you, for some reason, did not provide a certification number during registration, please email it to education@treefund.org. Right now, let's shift our focus to today's agenda. I'm really excited to introduce our speakers today. Dr. Susan Day is Professor of Urban Forestry in the Department of Forest Resources Management at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada. Dr. Day's research focuses on managing the below-ground systems to enhance urban tree growth and longevity in the context of environmental challenges such as land development and stormwater mitigation. She helps shape the Sustainable Sites Initiative, the sites crediting system for soils, and has published more than 150 book chapters and articles on urban forests and urban soils. She's the 2017 recipient of the Elsie Chadwick Award for Arboriculture Research. She holds a BA from Yale University, an MS from Cornell University, and a PhD from Virginia Tech. Laura Grant graduated from the State University of New York College of Environmental Science and Forestry with a Bachelor of Science degree in Forest Health. After her graduation, she worked in a variety of roles in the public service sector in the fields of forestry, urban forestry, and arboriculture. It was during this period that she earned her arborist certification from the International Society of Arboriculture. She's now working on completing her Master of Science in Urban Forestry at the University of British Columbia, where she is studying urban canopy loss in the City of Surrey, British Columbia. This promises to be an insightful and enriching session, and we're so excited to have all of you here with us today as part of it. Once again, thank you for your continued support. Enjoy the webinar. All right, Susan, I'm turning it over to you.
Okay, so I'm going to let Laura share screen. There we go. Okay, so nice to see everyone. Thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here as part of the Tree Fund webinar series. And as always, this work is supported by Tree Fund, and they've supported so much important urban forestry and arboriculture research over the years. So I personally want to thank the Tree Fund for their support of work I've done in the past and this work that Laura is carrying out now. So really appreciate that. It's super fun to see everyone from all over the world. And I think our topic today, I hope it will resonate with people, because one of the things we're really talking about in this study is how sort of the specifics of your region and your sort of configuration of problems intersects a little bit with tree protection during land development. So Without further ado, I just want to tell you a little bit about our study. I'm going to start off. Laura and I are going to be tag teaming a little bit, so I'll pass it off to Laura in a little bit. This is her master's project, and so she'll be presenting her data and all the details of this study. So just the origins, let's give you a little background. Where University of British Columbia is in Vancouver, Canada, and it's in the province of British Columbia. And it's in an area called the Lower Mainland. So it's on the main coast, but it's down in the southwest corner of the province. And it's a pretty mild climate. It rarely gets below freezing. It never gets particularly hot in the summer. But as you might know, Vancouver and the Vancouver metro area are one of the most rapidly densifying international cities probably in the world. And so we have some unique problems that relate to tree canopy preservation and tree canopy loss. So this study originated when the City of Surrey, which is part of the Metro Vancouver area, their urban forestry division approached me and said that, they have a lot of densification. They have people, the population growth in Surrey is really very rapid. We'll talk about that in a minute. And they were preserving all these trees during the development process, but their perception was that even though the trees were protected, over a few years after development was completed, it appeared that many trees were declining, and they were following best management practices and so forth. And they were interested in an investigation of their process and protection strategies and how that might be affecting the success long-term of tree protection. So one of the things I want to mention also before we get going is this: in British Columbia, there's quite a bit of concern with the effect of climate change as well. And that's also, in addition to rapid densification of urban areas, climate change is putting additional stress on trees. And so this picture you see in front of you is a photograph of Western red cedar decline. And the Western red cedar, Thuya plicata, is one of the most common species, and it's a native species here in British Columbia. And you can see how the needles in the tops of the canopy are getting kind of short and stunted, and you're even seeing dieback. And it seems to be associated with drought and perhaps root severance. So we're seeing trees in urban areas sort of suddenly die from this decline. And so this is also a widespread concern. It kind of intersects with climate change, because one of the effects of climate change in BC, which is British Columbia, is that summers, which are normally very dry, are even drier. So there's very little rainfall in the summer, and most of the rain is in the winter, and rainfall in winter is actually increasing. So next slide. So this is the study area. And so you can see in yellow in the upper left-hand corner, that shows a map of Canada with the United States at the bottom. The yellow is British Columbia, the province. And then in the lower left-hand corner, you can see the Lower Mainland area that I'm talking about, that little tiny yellow area. And then within that, we see Surrey here as part of the Metro Vancouver area. So there's lots of rivers coming in and so forth, but Surrey is right there in the metro area. So 60% of the population of British Columbia resides in this area. So it's very concentrated population. And in Surrey in particular, over 1,000 people a month move to the city of Surrey. And so it's rapidly transforming from forested and ag land to very dense urban development. Next slide. So we have this rapid densification, it's very rapid. The new housing is much denser than previous housing. So in some cases, like in city centers, we see a lot of apartment towers and so forth, that typical of many large international cities. But what we're seeing in Surrey is usually dense single family residential housing or townhouses. And another thing that's really unique or unusual, I think, about the situation is the native tree population. So there are the native forest is dominated by a few species. One of them is, western red cedar, western hemlock, Douglas fir, and these tend to be very large stature species. I think this is an incense cedar here, but we're talking about trees that are 150 to 200 feet tall. So, or even up to, 75, 100 meters tall. So these are very, very large trees. And when we have a highly densifying urban area, we end up with situations like in this picture where there's a tiny little piece of soil to hold a very, very large tree. And so this is an additional challenge that we're going to talk a little bit about in this study. Next slide. So this is City Park in Surrey. And so this is just a typical example. So Laura's going to get into the research where she has looked at the development process over a large number of plots in Surrey that have different land uses. And so this is very typical. We have sort of a forested land use, and we have some sort of single family homes at the border. And so this is pre-development. Next slide. And this is post-development. So we're talking about a radical change in structure. And if you can you go to the next? Let's see if we can overlay them. Yeah, so if you can see that, go back again. So can you see, if you can see that sort of retention pond there in the middle is where the forested area was. And now we're retaining trees according to the tree protection bylaw that the City of Surrey has, but it's being configured into these very, very tight spaces where we have a highly dense land development. Okay, so next slide. So one of the questions that we really have that relates to this is how the tree protection areas are configured when we're developing forested or agricultural, even previously developed land into these highly dense areas. And so you can see here that you are going to have, you're going to have individual trees in some cases that are protected. In other cases, you're going to have groups of trees. And sometimes you'll have sort of things that were previous visual screens or agricultural windbreaks or things like that. So however the land was developed beforehand is going to influence kind of the configuration of tree protection zones in the tree protection process. And so this is really what Laura's research is going to delve into, that we're going to present to you today, is how these sort of configurations are related to previous development and what the implications are for success in terms of tree preservation. And so we have, native tree species for the most part that are being protected, and we're trying to sort of shoehorn them into this very specific and very rigid, dense development pattern. Next slide. So this could create issues on its own in terms of the configuration of all these tree protection zones, but it may also indirectly have some effects in terms of, say, how many violations there are. And so here's an example of a large stature tree. And so this is a western red cedar, and you need to understand that this tree can grow to be several meters in diameter and hundreds of feet, or 50 to 75 meters tall. So very, very tall trees. And it's going to be in this very tiny space here. And what are the implications of that in terms of the longevity of this tree and sort of our success in managing and establishing these tree protection practices that we're all familiar with? Next slide. So these right here are the 4 of the 6 phases in that you may know if you're familiar with, I don't know if you can see my face, but the new BMP that's out from the ISA, managing trees during site development and construction. Next. And we are going to be focusing really on these first 2, the planning phase and the construction phase. So how things are selected for retention and how the tree protection is implemented, and then the tree protection itself. And as Paul mentioned earlier, I work a lot of my research is with soils and roots and below ground systems. And so the impacts on trees from root severance and so forth are also quite relevant to this discussion. So in this study, there's a lot of data. Laura has a lot of experience in ecological restoration and tree planting. She's also taught our tree identification classes at the University of British Columbia. So she has a lot of experience in tree establishment and protection and botany, essentially, and as well as forest health. And so she has really done an incredible in-depth analysis of every aspect of this process, looking at every single plot that is part of her data set and analyzing it in terms of canopy using LiDAR, and also how trees were selected, individual arborist reports, and where tree protection zones were put in and what the aftermath is. And so in this study, we're going to be looking at a couple of things that we're going to be talking about. So, but overall, in this study, we're looking at how trees are selected for retention. And we've found that it's being driven largely by size and convenience rather than sort of an overall strategy for which trees you might want to have as part of your urban forest going forward. We're also looking at the specifics of land use change and how these are affecting the configuration of tree protection zones. And that is largely what we're going to be talking about today. I mean, as you know, the sort of circle, the mythical circle that we draw around a tree to protect it. In practice, that rarely happens because there's so many site constraints, right? So we'll be looking at how land use is actually driving patterns of tree protection zones and species retention. And then another part of the study that we won't be looking at today is looking at the canopy loss. And Laura has done canopy height models for all of these plots, and she's looking at tree loss over time, and will be assessing its relationship to some of these things that we're talking about today. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over, next slide, to Laura, and she will take you into her data, and we'll be looking at tree protection zones in the city of Surrey and how it's intersecting with the process of tree protection during land development. Go for it, Laura.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Susan. So I'm going to start by just talking about the scales of canopy decline. We tend to look at it from a rather broad scale. We think about it at a regional level, like the Northeast or the Pacific Northwest in the United States. Or we look at it at maybe like a state or provincial scale. And then when you work for a municipality, you might have goals within your jurisdiction, such as you hear a lot of like goals for 30% urban tree canopy. However, we make our decisions at much smaller scales than how we're measuring our urban tree canopy. And so when we think about how we are going to be meeting those goals, we have to really understand where we're making our decisions. And so at a city level, we might have a tree, we're making decisions about individual trees. And so I've highlighted a square here about the size of a block. And so in Surrey, that's the scale we're looking at, and sometimes even smaller. It might just be, you know, a single lot within a block like that. But all of these little micro decisions that we're making about trees are what influences our overall large scale canopy goals that we've made. Just to give a little bit of background about Surrey. So Surrey has had bylaws to protect their trees in place since the 1990s. And so this means that homeowners or developers doing anything on private land have to get a permit to cut a tree down. And so whether you're a developer and you're doing something on a larger scale with hundreds of trees, thousands of trees, or if you're a homeowner making a decision about 1 or 2 trees, the process is a little bit different. But essentially, you need to get permission from the city in order to cut down a tree on private property. And so the City of Surrey has a heritage tree list. And so all of those trees have their protections. But in addition to that, they have that any tree over 30 centimeters in DBH is what is protected on private property. So there are a few exceptions to that. There's a few species that they have more significant protections for, but for the most part, trees that are protected are at least 30 centimeters in DBH. And so this image here is one that I pulled out of the bylaws that Surrey has. And it is the same picture that pretty much all of the municipalities in the Lower Mainland use. When I did a reverse image search, it's all of Lower Mainland and then Carson City, Nevada, which I've never been to, but none of those areas have trees that look like this, typically. We have much larger trees in the Pacific Northwest. And so their urban forest is kind of this weird dynamic of you have trees that are what growing up on the East Coast, I would consider normal trees that are like 50 to 60 feet in height, with a few exceptions. You know, your largest tree is probably going to be like a Norway spruce, Picea abies, and the Pacific Northwest trees really just make that look like a child's tree. It's these trees are getting, you know, 120 feet tall. They get quite large. And so in addition to having these very large stature trees that are native, they also have quite a few exotic species that you typically find in your urban forest, such as katsura, some ash species, Norway maple, as well as some East Coast of North America hardwoods. And so they do okay in the urban forest here, but because of the summer droughts, we don't see them with the same morphology that we do, morphology that we do on an area that doesn't have such extreme summer droughts. And so these droughts, there's essentially like a 3 to 4 month period where there's minimal to no precipitation at all. And so a lot of these Eurasian or northeastern, southeastern US and Canada species, they have what I would consider 70-year-old bark, but their DBH is less than 30 centimeters in DBH. So they're growing quite slowly compared to their counterparts planted on the East Coast. This makes for like a very unique dynamic that people in this area of the Pacific Northwest and British Columbia and Canada are dealing with. So this is the municipality of Surrey. I've outlined the 2 communities that we focused in on in red. And as I was selecting sites, we looked for sites that underwent development between 2009 and 2017. And once we had those sites, we looked back at those sites and made sure there was no development near trees between 2004 and 2009, just to ensure that there was no, if we saw trees declining, that those trees were not declining from any sort of construction or development that happened on site or adjacent to the site before. And so in total, we have 51 sites throughout both neighborhoods, and there's 131 tree protection zones that I delineated and did my analyses on. We requested reports from the City of Surrey. So when a developer wants to develop a site, they have to have both a planning and development report and an arborist report is generated. And so the arborist report is to act as a living document that monitors the trees from before the time of construction all the way through to construction's completion. So it goes through all of the trees that were on site beforehand, has an evaluation of all of these trees, all of the protected trees, I should say. So all of these trees are going to be at least 30 centimeters in DBH. And they are on a site map, so you know their exact location. And as the site goes through development, any sort of violations or concerns that the city has about these trees, they're going to be documented in this report. And so when we looked at the reports, if we saw there were violations, we discarded that TPZ, or in some cases, the whole site. So some sites had 4 or 5 instances of protection, and there were maybe only a violation in one of them. And other cases, you know, there was 1 instance of preservation, and there was a violation in that instance of preservation, and so that site would have been removed. In addition to using the arborist reports, we also use Google Earth and Street View to check for violations. So the City of Surrey does do a spot check system where if they've approved a plan, they will go out to the site periodically throughout construction to make sure that all of the TPZs are maintained, there's no violations, and then if there is a violation, they issue a stop work order. If they for all sites with construction, they must have this tree protection plan in place before they're allowed to start construction. So that means somebody at City Hall has signed off and said, yes, this plan, the number of trees that you've decided to protect is acceptable, and your method of protecting them is acceptable, and then construction can start. So I used a lot of Google Street View to verify, and then City of Surrey has its own program called Cosmos, where they have a much higher quality aerial images available. Google Earth tends to have about a 30-meter resolution, where the City of Surrey has a 10-meter resolution on their aerial images. So you can see a lot of fine detail in their aerial images, which was helpful. The first part of this was analyzing the preservation patterns. And so I classified these patterns into individuals and group protection. And so for individuals, we had squares and we had round. For groups, we had linear. And so linear is going to be more than 2 trees, but only 1 crown width wide. We have round again as a group tree preservation. So same thing, generally a round shape. We also have rectangular for groups. So for rectangular, we differentiated that from linear by if there are 2 trees or fewer, it would be a rectangle. Or if it was more than 2 trees, it would have a crown width of more than 1. So that means there would be trees planted next to each other instead of singly down a line. our large group preservation tended to be amorphous. So you would have these forest patches that were leftovers, and they would kind of cut them into these weird shapes like I've outlined here. And so we just describe this as amorphous. And so these patterns are also found in ecology as well. And so we are trying to apply this idea of edge influence in a common theme in ecology to our TPZ or tree protection zone areas. And so we're going to use the term edge influence index because a lot of times when we hear edge effect, we think of species diversities, and this is like an especially common term to discuss like bird diversity as, and so edge influence index is a more all-encompassing term to assess all of the different drivers and all the different drivers and processes at work in these TPZ zones. And so when we are creating a TPZ, we want to make sure that we're protecting the trees that we've identified to protect. And so when we have a shape like a linear shape like this one here, we're not really seeing a core area to protect. And so we want to make sure there's essentially a buffer, whether it's other trees or just space, to protect the trees, not only from things like root severance, but also from the pressures of being on the edge. So things such as wind, heat, stuff that the inner trees are not used to being exposed to. And so in forest fragmentation research and in logging studies, there's a lot of research looking at how do you protect these core areas, but we haven't really seen it with TPZs or the preservation of trees in the urban environment. But Susan and I both agree that there's a lot of overlap there. So one of the things that we had noticed as I was going through and delineating all these different TPZ areas was different land uses tended to have different kinds of TPZ formations. And so in previously developed areas, we have specimen trees a lot of times. And so those are going to be individual trees that are preserved. And so they tend to either get that square or they get a round or circular type of TPZ. In Canada, they have, they take after the UK. And so there's a lot of hedges, a lot of screening that goes on there. And so you see these very linear hedges. Sometimes they're of a cultivar of a fall cedar like Thuya, but a lot of times it's still Thuya plicata, the western red cedar, that they're forcing into these very tight hedges. Also, in previously developed areas, we can see some of these amorphous areas that I've outlined kind of in the center here, where they're using it as a privacy screen. It's just kind of this unkempt area that is a mix of native, sometimes non-native trees. In agricultural sites, we tend to see more rectangular preservation styles. There's a lot of windbreaks. There's also some specimen trees, and so we see some individual preservation there as well. And so after the development here, you can see in the circles where I've highlighted what they decided to keep. But the style of TPZ here is much more limited in diversity. For the forested land uses, we tend to see a lot of amorphous shapes, and they're very large. So like I mentioned before, where they have this chunk of forest and they just kind of leave this organic edge to it. We see that very commonly in the forest areas. And so I've outlined here some anchor points so that you can kind of focus as the landscape changes. And so here at development, you can see where there was previously developed our anchor points here. They selected out individual trees. We have our forest fragments here where they're amorphous shape. And then up in here, they had some random trees that they pulled out of that forest patch to protect as well. And so this is 6 years after the development was complete, and you can see how much more light is coming into these forest patches. They were mostly evergreen forest. So you can see like there are some hardwoods in there, but the crowns are thinner. You can see the dieback shadows too in a lot of these trees. And if you look at the shadows, you can see these random trees that they kind of pulled out of the forest. Some of those have some dieback in the shadow as well. And so this is an example of some of these like random trees that they pulled out of the forest to protect. These here are Douglas fir, so pseudotsuga, and there's a group of 4 that they protected in kind of a round area. And an important thing to mention with Douglas fir is that these trees are going to have to be thinned at some point because Douglas fir can grow to the circumference of this entire area. So at some point, the homeowner is going to have to apply for a permit, pay a fee, and cut some of these trees down in order to have a healthy tree. But if we look at this image on the right, like some of these trees do not have the greatest taper, so they're not the most wind firm of trees selected out. And then also they're extremely close to this house and the neighbor's house. And they're very tall trees. So it's not like your neighbor, 2-3 doors down is safe from these trees if they were to fail in a heavy windstorm. Douglas fir is also a species that will drop branches. And so these branches will cause significant damage to a house when it's dropped. So this is one of the things that arborists in the Pacific Northwest kind of have to deal with making these decisions is, yes, they want to save trees. Yes, they want to save trees that'll be an asset in the future. However, it might not have been the best choice to save one of those trees. So they saved a group, but that homeowner is now going to have to take care of the thinning and the dropping of branches as this tree recovers from the significant disturbance that is development. And so now I'm going to move on to the analysis of the TPZs that I did. This first one, previous land use and percent TPZ exposed. So in most areas of, especially the previously developed areas, not 100% of the TPZ was exposed to construction. So when we have these screens or these hedges, a lot of times there's only development on one side or less than one side because they're between lots. But in some instances, you have like the other trees that were selected for retention in this area, they had construction and development on all sides of their TPZ. And so that means root severance and compaction on all sides. Whereas these trees that were in the screen and the hedge, they only lost roots on the one side. And so when we looked at what was preserved based on land use, previously developed sites had the greatest diversity of what TPZs were exposed to in terms of construction. So you had some areas where, less than about 10% maybe was exposed to construction and root severance, all the way up to 100%. And so the line in these box plots is going to be the median. So more than half of these had 100% of their TPZ area exposed. When we move to forested and agriculture, we're not seeing we're seeing a lot less small exposure, and we're seeing more exposure more frequently into this heavier exposure of root severance and compaction. And so that goes back to how they're developing the lot and where trees are placed throughout the lot. So when you have a windbreak and it's in the center of your parcel, you're developing all sides of that and kind of just shoving your tree preservation around your development. So this graph is going to look at the edge influence index and the TPZ shape. And so with the edge influence index, a higher number means that there's more exposure and less protection in the center, and a lower value is going to mean that there is more protection of that core and less exposure to the edge. And our results differed from that graphic I showed in the beginning, where our amorphous has the most protection of the core. And that's likely because all of our amorphous areas were very large in size. So we didn't have any small amorphous patches. They were all quite large. So that skewed our results that way. This is the median again for the line. And then looking at the square that has a very high edge influence index. And that's because those tended to be, those were 100% individual trees, and they tended to be very small trees as well. And then with the round, rectangular, and linear, they were about, the median falls in a similar place, but you can see that their index values are quite low, they're quite low. They have pretty significant ranges, and that's because we had such different sizes of protection for all of those areas. So again, we're going to look at edge influence and previous land use. With the previously developed areas, we had a pretty big range, same with agriculture, pretty big range of edge influence index. And that's because we had lots of linear parcels, we had some square parcels, we had round parcels, TPZs. We had a lot of diversity in our TPZs for both, primarily for previously developed, but also for agriculture, where we saw windbreaks that were linear. We saw specimen trees that were in their squares, and since those tended to be in small trees, they had a high edge influence index, whereas our forest has a very low edge influence index because those tended to be our largest area TPZs. And so they may have been amorphous, meaning, there was a lot of surface area that the roots were exposed to, but they were so large that we were definitely protecting a core of trees. This graph here is comparing the edge influence index to TPZ area, and each shape corresponds to one of the shapes that I identified earlier in the presentation. And so if we look at our squares with the previous box plots, we saw that had a very high edge influence index. So the area of those was quite small, generally only had one young tree in it. And so there's a lot of exposure of that tree to the compaction, to the increased sunlight, to root severance. And then with rectangular, so these are starting to get wider parcels. We can see they start, mostly start around here and are round TPZs. So I combined those in this. So circle is going to be our individual trees, and that's going to be the trees that are closest to our y-axis here. And then the round circle or circle groups for our group preservation, they're going to start to go over into here. And then our linear TPZs, they didn't follow so much a pattern. You can see they're kind of the outliers of this graph. But essentially, we see a very steep drop off around 75 meters squared for our area, meaning that once we get past 75 meters squared, we're seeing a lot less pressure from the edge on our parcel, on our trees. And so if we're thinking that the core area is what we really want to protect, we need some sort of buffer, whether it's just regular old space or it's extra trees that are going to alleviate the edge pressures from the trees that are good candidates for retention. And so comparing this back to the BMP and what Surrey does, Surrey has kind of mashed planning and design into one phase. And so when Susan said that they're kind of shoehorning in their tree retention into a site, it's like, I think it is because they've combined planning and design into one phase. And so a arborist who's hired by the developer is given a design from the developer, and they decide based on that design what trees are going to be protected. And so instead of evaluating the resource as a whole and then trying to figure out where the building or the structure is going to go after, they've kind of started with the structure and they're trying to fit the trees around it. And so they are assessing these trees as individuals and then trying to force them into place, as opposed to assessing the trees as groups and saying, okay, this group has, the soils are good here. These trees look to be healthy and thriving. This is the area we're going to preserve, and then we'll fit the building in around that. And so our recommendation, I guess, is to follow the VMP, because that seems to help fit the preservation in at the beginning, and kind of shifts that focus to be on the trees. And so additional analyses that I'm looking at, we're looking at the LiDAR. So every 5 years, City of Surrey has LiDAR flown. And so I have the LiDAR for the year shown there. And so we're looking to see, based on land use and based on these configuration of TPZs, is it working? And so we can, especially in the latter years, we can pick out these individual crowns of trees that were saved and say, okay, this one was saved. Does it have a full crown still? Is the tree still there? Or is there a gap in the canopy? And then based on that, we're hoping to help Surrey alter their standards for TPZ so that it's something more suited to their climate and their species of trees. Okay. So we'd like to thank Tree Fund They supported this project. And so I was able to buy a fancy computer to look at the LiDAR, and I was able to have a livable wage in Vancouver. So thank you to Tree Fund. And that's all.
Okay, so just to finish up, I think I've been busily answering questions in the Q&A session while Laura's been talking, and we're going to have some time for questions here. And I think one of the things that you can see from Laura's work, and I think a lot of the questions and comments in the chat are echoing this, is that when we have this tree bylaw, in this case, which is focused on individual trees, and says, you know, when a tree is removed, any tree over 30 centimeters, correct me if I'm wrong, Laura, because people have been asking about this, any tree over 30 centimeters that's been removed, that is to be removed, requires either replacement or payment into a green fund, right? And an assessment and a permit. So all these trees get inventoried in these arborist reports, and then trees are selected for protection. But what we're seeing, and as you might expect, and from what Laura just presented to you, the trees that get protected is really driven by sort of the urban form, like the configuration of this dense housing. And I have seen some comments in the chat saying, that's not really dense housing. I mean, it's all relative, right? I mean, it could be like Singapore or, you know, Beijing or something, but this is in terms of like the amount of soil that's left exposed. If we think about it in those terms, it's really very dense. I mean, there's not much space, and those spaces are really chopped up. And so we're looking at individual trees through our policy, but the way it's coming out when you're actually practicing, you're actually deploying this policy, is it's all configured by the stamp of the development pattern. So I don't know, Laura, do you have anything else you want to add to that, or we just open it up for questions?
Open up for questions.
Okay, we're ready. Heath, let us know what question we should address.
Well, you're probably the better expert at what questions you should address, but I will say there is a program evaluation for most all of you. To feel free, let us know your feedback, so that we can make the future webinars better. But I also want to thank, I appreciate your thanking, Laura, but we really want to thank you both for your hard work that you've done, over the past few years, and even in today's webinar. It was obviously, as you can see, the numbers of people attending the whole webinar and the feedback and the questions that we've got. This is really important and relatable information. So thank you all. And hopefully, thank you all also those attending for filling out our program evaluation. This will continuously help us. Susan and Laura, I hope I've also bought you a couple seconds to look through some of those Q&A questions if you would like to answer any of those. And then lastly, for those that are still in here, if you do have any questions, please put those in the Q&A. Look through those that Susan has been diligently answering. And we will have this webinar up in probably 1 to 2 weeks on our archive page, our webinar archive page. So please feel free to look at that if you want to revisit some of this. We do have past webinars on there as well for you to take a look at. And lastly, again, before I hand it truly back to Susan and Laura, we appreciate all the support, whether it is your time being on this webinar or for those that are willing and able to support us financially on this Giving Tuesday. It is an honor to be able to present this information and to help this community grow on and on. So thank you.
Okay, so Laura, why don't I read a question and you answer it, okay? Because I think there's a number of questions about these two topics. So it's two questions I think would be worth discussing. So Jay Banks asks, he says, basically the municipality has set up the homeowner for failure of their saved trees with an extreme cost of removal after significant targets have been in place in the way of removal. So this is, I guess it's more of a statement than a question, but the question is are we sort of deferring the tree preservation question onto the eventual homeowners in this strategy?
I think so. So the arborist is making, Surrey requires that the person doing the resource evaluation, this inventory of all the trees on site, requires that they have their ISA, just a general certification for an arborist, and that they hold the track qualification. So you have someone out here making an educated assessment of the trees. However, yeah, they are kind of putting the follow-up of these trees onto the homeowner. So the homeowner has to now hire a qualified tree person to come out and make another assessment, and it's putting all that cost onto the homeowner. And so Surrey is advertised to the millennials of Lower Mainland as an affordable place to buy a home, but it's still ridiculous. Like the cheapest lot is going to be $250,000, but most of these homes are going to be millions of dollars. And so I'm not sure if the idea is if they can afford to buy a home here, they can afford to make these tree decisions, or contract out these tree decisions. But it is definitely pushing the cost of follow-up maintenance onto the homeowner. And I don't know, like the house that I showed with the 4 Douglas fir, like I would never want to buy a house that had 4 Douglas fir with barely a taper, you know, like 3 meters from my front door.
Yeah. And I think one thing it's important to understand is in BC, there are just a handful of native species that are, you know, that are common, right? So there's Western red cedar, there's Douglas fir, there's Western hemlock, there's a few other firs. So they tend to be, you know, conifers and large stature trees. And then if you get into, say, the city of Vancouver, it has the street trees there are all exotic species, non-natives, and they have a very high species diversity in the city of Vancouver and a really wide variety of trees that are planted. But those are just 2 completely separate tree populations. And so I think one aspect of this is that the Surrey bylaw and many bylaws, right, they focus on individual trees because as arborists, we know how to protect, you know, individual trees, but we also know how to protect stands of trees, right? And I think another question that came up, Laura, maybe you can speak to this, is someone said, given your results, would it be better to focus retention in a few large areas as opposed to many small lots? And I think I'll let Laura elaborate on this, but I think one thing that really is clear from this analysis, and we will be publishing some papers on which trees have been selected for retention and how that's affecting overall canopy down the road, as well as the canopy loss and the different configurations that Laura was talking about today. But I think that we have bylaws that have their origins, in some cases, in our knowledge about how to protect a single tree. And we perhaps need to take a step back and really start thinking outside the box about how to address this problem in a way that's not only effective in terms of our large scale goals, but also more compatible with property owners and homeowners and their eventual desires. So I don't know. So Laura, do you think it would be better to focus retention on a few large areas as opposed to many small lots?
So in the forested land use, I would say yes. Like, the trees that they just randomly pull out of the forest and throw a TPZ around, those trees have very low live crown ratios. They don't really have a taper. So they're not really wind firm. So if there's any sort of extreme event to go through there, you would expect those trees to fail. So on the forested land use, it'd be much better for them to have a few large areas of retention, and then remove the others. With the previously developed areas or the agricultural previous land uses, there are some specimen type plantings in there, meaning you have an individual tree planted, it's got sun on all sides of it, and so it has a good healthy crown, it has a good taper, and if they were to have the building designed after, they could try to keep that tree. A lot of the previously developed sites and a lot of the ag sites, they have some non-native trees that aren't going to be these giant trees that could be a real risk next to a house. So I think it depends on your land use, but if you're able to save trees that are wind firm, and it's feasible, and you can make sure that your development is planned around that instead of, having your TPZ just kind of shoved into this development you've already planned for. Yeah, I think you can have some more smaller instances of protection with those land uses versus the forest with the giant native trees.
I do want to recognize it is a few minutes past the hour. So for those that are still on, your time has been recorded. You will still continue to get your ISA. We've had a lot of questions. Tree Fund will be submitting your ISA information that you provided during registration. We will submit those that had attended a majority of this webinar as it was recorded when you attended and when you dropped out as well. I don't know, Susan and Laura, if you guys have any time left, or if you do have any questions, feel free. You'd see Laura's email up there if you have any specific questions that we're not able to get today. I assume that you would welcome those emails and those questions here.
Yeah, so I think I'm trying to look over the questions to see if there's anything else that that we haven't really answered. And I think another, and I'm sure that there are, I mean, I welcome anyone who would like to email me or Laura, after the webinar. We'll be happy to hear from you. I also think a number of people have put links to their own tree protection plans, and I think that's fantastic, and I hope that people have made use of that, because I think it's great to see what other people are doing in the Lower Mainland in British Columbia. I mean, it is a really challenging situation, and it's challenging because not only because of the densification, but also just sort of the climate and the species mix. I mean, a lot of the native species are not compatible in these kind of typical urban forms where you have like the tree in your front yard, so I really think that this is a call to think about, to not try to apply the same approach to every area of the world. And we've had people from all over the world today at the webinar. So I saw people from Hong Kong and other places flashing through at the beginning. And so every single one of those places is going to have a different situation that they have to address. And this concept of comprehensive planning that kind of puts trees at a higher level in the decision-making process, I think is needed. You know, you can't say, oh, this is what we want to build, and then how are we going to fit trees in there? The trees need to be part of the process from the beginning. Otherwise, I think this is the kind of conflict we end up with. So anyway, thank you everyone for attending. And Laura, do you have any final last words, or are we?
No, thanks everyone.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so I will look through these questions. If I see any more I can answer in the window, I will do so. And otherwise, we'll just say goodbye to everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.